Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome for the very first time. Tonight, we're embarking on perhaps the largest, most chaotic, and most complicated story in the Western world, Greek mythology. We're going to cover the entire thing, from the very beginning of creation, the primordial dew, all the way to the end of the heroic age. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to get more high-quality historical videos just like this one. But we're going to do it in our usual calm and incredibly slow way. Forget the thrilling battles of gods and heroes. We're going to focus on the awkward family dynamics, the endless affairs, the sheer hypocrisy, and the bizarre personal grudges that defined the Greek cosmos. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our slow, sleepy descent into the original divine drama. The beginning, when there was just nothing. We start before the gods, before the titans, even before the earth as we know it. In the very beginning, there was just chaos. Now, don't think of chaos in the modern sense, like a messy room or a traffic jam. In the Greek sense, chaos was the absolute void, the gaping black nothingness that existed before anything else. It was the original cosmic goo. From this great void, the very first entities spontaneously emerged. We call these the primordial deities, and they represent the fundamental building blocks of the universe. The first three were the most important. Gaia, or Gaia, the earth itself, the foundation, the fertile ground. Uranus, or Uranus, the sky, stretching over the earth. Tartarus, the deep abyss beneath the earth, a kind of cosmic prison that we'll visit later. And then there was Eros, the driving force of creation, not the cute cherub we think of today, but the primordial sexual urge or attraction that compelled things to reproduce. Without Eros, nothing would ever have happened. So, in the beginning, you had the earth, the sky, the abyss, and the urge to mate. This is where the truly dysfunctional family history begins. Gaia and Uranus, the first bad marriage. Gaia, Earth, and Uranus, the sky, were the first great coupling. As the earth and the sky, they fit together perfectly, and they produced the next generation of powerful beings. Their children were numerous, but we only really care about two groups. The Cyclopses, three giant one-eyed beings. They were powerful, skilled craftsmen, but Uranus thought they were hideous. And the Hecatonchires, three truly monstrous giants with 50 heads and 100 hands each. Uranus was absolutely disgusted by them. Uranus, the sky god, turned out to be a truly awful father. He hated the appearance of his children, especially the Hecatonchires, and in a deeply weird and possessive move, he refused to let them be born. He literally pushed them back into Gaia's womb. This, of course, caused Gaia, the earth, enormous physical pain and spiritual distress. She was bulging with her unwanted, imprisoned children, and she was desperate for relief. The rise of the Titans. However, Gaia and Uranus also produced a third, less monstrous set of 12 children, the Titans, 6 males and 6 females. These were the first generation of true gods, huge in size, but more human in form. The Titans are important, and we should name the most significant ones. Cronus, or Kronos, the youngest and most ambitious male Titan. He will be the central figure of the next era. Rhea, Cronus' sister, who will become his wife. Oceanus, the Titan of the endless ocean stream that was believed to encircle the world. Tethys, the Titaness of the sea. Mnemosyne, the Titaness of memory. Gaia, desperate to be free of Uranus's cruel imprisonment, appealed to her Titan children to rise up against their father. They were mostly afraid. After all, he was the sky itself.
But the youngest and most ambitious, Cronus, stepped forward. Cronus's terrible deed. Gaia gave Cronus the ultimate weapon for this awful task, a great sickle made of the hardest stone. When Uranus descended to couple with Gaia, Cronus, who was hiding, attacked. In a dark, brutal, and incredibly decisive act, Cronus castrated his own father, Uranus. Uranus, wounded and shrieking, recoiled from the earth and flew back into the sky, where he remains to this day. The moment he was driven away, the imprisoned Cyclopses and Hecatontures were freed from Gaia's womb. But the story doesn't end there. From the divine blood, or more accurately, the divine semen, that fell from the sky onto the earth and into the sea, new beings were created. The Furies, or Erinyes, vengeful spirits who relentlessly pursue those who shed the blood of a family member. They are the personification of divine domestic violence retribution. The giants, massive, powerful beings who will cause trouble later. And, from the sea foam created by the castrated genitals, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, was born. So, the first act of creation and the birth of the goddess of love came directly from an act of patricide and castration. This sets the tone for the rest of Greek mythology, which is filled with sex, violence, and incredibly messed up family relationships. The age of Cronus and the problem of prophecy. With Uranus defeated, Cronus became the supreme ruler of the cosmos, ushering in the age of the Titans. He married his sister Rhea, and they established their rule over the universe from Mount Othrys. However, Cronus, having committed such a profound act of violence against his own father, was immediately cursed by a deep paranoia. Uranus prophesied that one of Cronus's own children would rise up and overthrow him, just as Cronus had overthrown Uranus. Paranoia, as we know, is a very strong genetic trait in this family. Cronus didn't want to end up in the same painful situation as his father. So, Cronus devised a truly monstrous solution. As soon as Rhea gave birth to their children, Cronus swallowed them whole. He literally consumed his own divine offspring the moment they emerged. Rhea was naturally heartbroken. She bore 6 children, and they were all swallowed immediately. Hestia, Hades, Demeter, Poseidon, and Hera. She was pregnant with the 6th child, and she was desperate to save at least one. She knew that if she didn't, the tyranny of Cronus would never end. The birth of Zeus. When Rhea was about to give birth to her final child, she pleaded with her parents, Gaia and Uranus, to help her hide the baby. Gaia hid Rhea on the island of Crete to give birth in secret. Rhea delivered the final, ultimate child of the Titan age, Zeus. To deceive Cronus, Rhea wrapped a large stone in baby clothes and presented it to her husband. Cronus, suspecting nothing because he was both tyrannical and kinda dim, immediately swallowed the stone. Zeus was thus saved and hidden in a cave on Crete. He was secretly raised there by nymphs and protected by the Curetes, a group of warrior dancers who would clash their shields and weapons loudly whenever the baby Zeus cried, ensuring that Cronus never heard him. While Zeus grew up in secret, strong and healthy, Cronus swallowed the stone, content that he had thwarted prophecy. He was about to find out how wrong he was, kicking off the second great family war, which will forever define Greek history. All right, everyone. We left off with the ultimate toddler tantrum, Zeus secretly growing up on Crete while his supremely arrogant father Cronus felt safe after swallowing a rock wrapped in a blanket. It's time for the second great family war, the one that defines the entire pantheon we know today, the Titanomachy. The awkward reunion. Zeus eventually grew into a powerful, charismatic, and incredibly determined young god. He knew he couldn't face the entrenched power of the Titans alone, so he needed a plan to free his older siblings, who were still residing, uncomfortably, in Cronus's massive Titan stomach. He was helped in this by a few key allies, most notably the Titaness Metis, Wisdom, who is the first of Zeus's many, many wives, because why start a war without getting married first? Metis gave Zeus a powerful herbal concoction. Zeus, disguised or acting as a servant, tricked his father, Cronus, into drinking this specialized mixture. The herb was a powerful emetic, and it forced Cronus to violently vomit up all 5 of his swallowed children, Hestia, Hades, Demeter, Poseidon, and Hera, along with the stone he had consumed years earlier. Imagine that family reunion. The siblings emerged fully grown, furious, and probably covered in cosmic gastric juices, ready to destroy the parent who had ingested them. This reunion of the 6 siblings forms the core of the eventual Olympian family. The Great War: Titans versus Olympians. The stage was set for the Titanomachy, the decade-long war between the 2 generations of gods. The Olympians, led by Zeus and based on Mount Olympus, hence the name, this group included the freed siblings and a few key, opportunistic younger titans who defected, like Prometheus, Forethought, and Epimetheus, Afterthought. The Titans, led by Cronus and based on Mount Othrys, this group included the rest of the original 12, who naturally felt loyalty to the established regime. This was not a quick, glorious battle. It was a grueling, protracted conflict that lasted for 10 entire years. The 2 sides were perfectly matched in power, causing catastrophic damage to the cosmos in the process. Zeus knew he needed allies with immense raw power. He descended into the dark realm of Tartarus, where Cronus, after taking power, had imprisoned the monstrous children from the first generation. Zeus freed the very creatures his father and grandfather had despised, the Cyclops. In gratitude for their freedom, the Cyclops gifted Zeus his greatest weapon, the thunderbolt, or lightning bolt. They also forged the helmet of invisibility for Hades and the trident for Poseidon. The Hecatonchires, with their 100 hands and incredible strength, these giants were able to throw mountains and boulders at the Titan lines, acting as the ultimate heavy artillery. With these new specialized weapons and monstrous allies, the tide finally turned. The end of the Titans. The war concluded with the overwhelming victory of the Olympian faction. The defeated Titans were rounded up, and in a perfect example of generational karmic retribution, imprisoned in the deepest, darkest pit of the underworld, Tartarus. Zeus personally set the Hecatonchires to stand perpetual guard over the Titans in Tartarus, ensuring they would never again escape to challenge the cosmos. There were, however, a few notable exceptions. Atlas, the Titan leader in the field, received a unique and truly horrible punishment. He was condemned to stand forever on the western edge of the world and hold the heavens upon his shoulders. The defectors, Prometheus and Epimetheus, were spared because they wisely chose the winning side. Establishing the divine hierarchy. With the Titans defeated, the 6 siblings, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, were now the undisputed rulers of the universe. The first order of business was to divide up the spoils, using a rather simple method, drawing lots. This casual act determined the 3 primary spheres of influence. Zeus drew the lot for the sky and the air. He became the supreme ruler, the king of the gods, ruling from the heights of Mount Olympus. Poseidon drew the lot for the sea, all oceans, rivers, and waters. He became the god of the sea and, quite randomly, the god of horses and earthquakes, because why not have 3 jobs? Hades drew the worst lot, the underworld, the realm of the dead. Hades was not the god of death, that was Thanatos, but the ruler of the dead souls. He was immediately relegated to the dark below, rarely venturing up to Olympus, and consequently he has a much darker, gloomier, and less gossipy reputation than his brothers. Hera, Zeus's sister, who he later married, because remember, incest is a recurring theme here, became the queen of the gods, goddess of marriage, and, tragically, the goddess of jealousy, because of Zeus's constant infidelity. Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home, and Demeter, goddess of the harvest and grain, kept their domains, but did not achieve the same cosmic prominence as the three brothers. This division of power established the foundation for the Olympian pantheon, which would rule for the rest of Greek history. The final challenge, the gigantomachy. Just when Zeus thought he was done with family uprisings, Gaia, the Earth Mother, was furious about how Zeus had treated her Titan children. Remember, they were imprisoned in her body, Tartarus. She decided to launch one last desperate attempt to overthrow the Olympians. She birthed a new terrifying generation of monsters, the giants, leading to the final war, the gigantomachy. The giants were massive, strong, and powerful, but ultimately they were defeated by the combined might of the Olympians, often with the help of heroes who were sometimes Zeus's illegitimate children, because why not use your illegitimate children to fight your grandmother? With the giants defeated and buried beneath mountains, volcanoes were explained as their restless movements, the supremacy of Zeus and the Olympians was finally, irreversibly secured. The chaotic age of creation and war was over. Now we can focus on the truly exhausting, petty, and often hilarious reign of the supreme family, the Olympians. This starts, of course, with the relationship between Zeus and everyone else.
All right, everyone. We're deep into the cosmic lullaby now. The great wars are over, the cosmos is organized, mostly. The foundation is set. Now we get to the really good stuff. The petty, chaotic, and utterly exhausting drama of the Olympians living together on Mount Olympus. At the center of it all, of course, is Zeus, the king of the gods. He was powerful, decisive, and generally successful in ruling the universe, but his personal life was a spectacular, unrelenting train wreck. Zeus and Hera, a marriage made in hell. Zeus married his sister, Hera. This was meant to be the ultimate sacred union, solidifying their co-rule of the sky. Hera became the goddess of marriage, of women, and of childbirth. The irony, of course, is that her marriage was the most spectacular failure in the entire pantheon. Zeus was a profound and chronic philanderer. He possessed an almost uncontrollable libido and viewed every beautiful nymph, mortal woman, or goddess as a personal challenge. Zeus's method of seduction was often less about romance and more about deception, trickery, or outright force. He was a master of divine disguise. He turned himself into a white bull to abduct the Phoenician princess Europa. He disguised himself as a swan to seduce Leda. He transformed into a shower of golden rain to reach Danae while she was locked in a tower. Hera, as the goddess of marriage, was naturally furious. Her life became a relentless, single-minded quest for vengeance against Zeus's partners, and, even more cruelly, against the illegitimate children that resulted from these affairs. Hera's primary role in Greek mythology is thus the magnificent, terrifying embodiment of jealousy and righteous anger. She was constantly thwarted by Zeus's power, so she channeled her rage into ingenious punishments for his mistresses, like turning Io into a cow, and relentless persecution of his heroic sons, like Heracles. It's an ironic contrast. The king of the gods was defined by his inability to control his impulses, and the queen of the gods was defined by the unending stress of trying to police him. Their relationship was a continuous cycle of Zeus cheating, Hera shrieking, and some poor nymph or hero paying the price. The next generation, a collection of talents and problems. From this chaotic union and Zeus's various dalliances, the next major generation of Olympian gods was born, each with their own particular flaws and specialties.
Hammer, Hephaestus, the unwanted genius. Hera, furious that Zeus had birthed Athena entirely by himself, more on that in a moment, decided to try to birth a child without him. The result was Hephaestus, the god of the forge, fire, and craftsmanship. Unfortunately for Hera, Hephaestus was born lame and physically deformed. Hera, in a truly awful moment of maternal rejection, was so disgusted by his appearance that she tossed him from Mount Olympus. Hephaestus fell for an entire day, landing in the ocean where he was nursed back to health by sea nymphs. He grew up bearing a permanent grudge against his mother. Hephaestus was the ultimate cosmic genius, the master architect and blacksmith, but he was also the marginalized, emotionally scarred son of the queen of the gods. His vengeance was subtle. He sent his mother a beautiful, intricately crafted throne. When Hera sat on it, she was instantly bound by invisible chains and couldn't move. The other gods had to beg Hephaestus, the son she rejected, to return to Olympus and free her. He only agreed after being heavily intoxicated, of course. Ares was the legitimate son of Zeus and Hera. He was the god of war, but not the strategic, glorious kind of war. That was Athena's domain. Ares was the god of bloodshed, violence, chaos, and brute fury. Ares was handsome, arrogant, and often deeply unpopular with the other gods, including his own parents. Zeus once called him the most hateful god dwelling on Olympus, because Zeus preferred strategic deceit to simple violence, apparently. Ares' main pastime was having a scandalous, long-running affair with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who, as we remember, was born from the castration of Uranus. Their affair was so notorious that her husband, the lame Hephaestus, eventually built a massive invisible net over their bed to catch them in the act and display them to the rest of the Olympians for public humiliation. It's this kind of petty, embarrassing drama that really defined Mount Olympus. Athena, the brains, and the headache. Athena's birth was perhaps the most unusual. Zeus was once married to Metis, wisdom. A prophecy foretold that Metis would bear a son who would eventually overthrow Zeus. Zeus, remembering his father and grandfather's fates, decided to prevent this prophecy in the only way he knew. He swallowed Metis whole. Later, Zeus developed a monumental, unbearable headache. He cried out in pain until Hephaestus, or sometimes Prometheus, was called to crack open Zeus's head with an axe. From Zeus's forehead, fully formed, fully armored, and shouting a war cry, sprang Athena, the goddess of wisdom, strategic war, and handicrafts. Athena became Zeus's favorite child. She embodied calm reason and military strategy, perfectly contrasting her half-brother Ares. She was a virgin goddess, often rejecting the chaos of sexuality that defined her family. Sun, Apollo, and Artemis, the golden twins. The twins Apollo, god of the sun, music, archery, and prophecy, and Artemis, goddess of the hunt, the moon, and wild animals, were born from one of Zeus's affairs with the titaness Leto. Hera, of course, relentlessly persecuted Leto, forcing her to wander the earth until she finally found refuge on the floating island of Delos, where the twins were born. Apollo and Artemis were often characterized by their shared skill with the bow and arrow and their incredible beauty. They were fiercely protective of their mother and incredibly aggressive when defending their own honor, often unleashing plagues or volleys of arrows on any mortal who dared to disrespect them. This collection of dysfunctional siblings, the lame smith, the murderous brute, the strategic brain, and the archer twins, formed the core ruling body of the Greek world, and their actions would constantly bleed down into the world of mortals. Let's let the sound of Hera's endless shouting and the metallic clang of Hephaestus's forge gently fade as we move to the gods' often awkward, meddling interactions with the world of mortals.
All right, everyone. We're drifting away from the petty domestic disputes on Mount Olympus and floating down to Earth, where the gods decided to play their next major game. the creation and subsequent torment of mankind. This part of the story introduces two crucial non-Olympian figures, Prometheus, forethought, and his brother, Epimetheus, afterthought. Remember them? They were the Titans who wisely defected during the Titanomachy, ensuring they weren't tossed into Tartarus. The problem of creation. When the Olympians finally secured their rule, they needed subjects. Zeus tasked Prometheus and Epimetheus with creating the creatures that would populate the earth. Epimetheus, true to his name, afterthought, rushed in and distributed all the natural gifts, speed, strength, fur, wings, to the animals. When he finally got to man, he realized he had given away everything. Man was left naked, weak, and defenseless. Prometheus, forethought, felt a deep responsibility for the creation he now saw floundering on Earth. He decided that humanity needed a compensatory gift to survive the harsh world. The Great Deception and the gift of fire. The Olympians, especially Zeus, expected tribute from the mortals in the form of sacrifices. Prometheus, ever the clever trickster and defender of man, devised a plan to save humans from having to give the gods all the best parts of the sacrificial animals. During a great feast, Prometheus prepared two piles. One pile contained the bones and less savory bits, cunningly wrapped in rich, glistening animal fat. The other pile contained the best cuts of meat, covered with the unappetizing sight of the animal's intestines. Prometheus then asked Zeus to choose which pile would be perpetually offered to the gods. Zeus, seeing the rich fat on the first pile and thinking he was clever, chose the pile of bones. He was tricked. He was furious, but he was bound by his own decree. From that day forward, mortals sacrificed the fatty bones to the gods and kept the delicious meat for themselves. Zeus was absolutely enraged by Prometheus's constant support for mankind and his blatant deception. He decided to punish humanity by withdrawing the ultimate gift of comfort and civilization, fire. Prometheus, unwilling to see his creations freeze and stumble in the dark, climbed Mount Olympus, stole a spark of fire from Hephaestus's forge, or sometimes from the sun chariot, and brought it down to earth, hiding it inside a fennel stalk. This gift of fire lifted humanity out of the primitive state and into civilization. Zeus's revenge, Prometheus's eternal suffering. Zeus's rage at this second act of defiance was monumental. He needed to punish Prometheus in a spectacular, eternal way. Hephaestus and the divine servant seized Prometheus and took him to the distant Caucasus Mountains. There they chained him with unbreakable bonds to a massive rock face. The punishment was tailored to be eternal and excruciating. Every day, a giant eagle or vulture, a symbol of Zeus, would fly down and devour Prometheus's liver. Since Prometheus was immortal, his liver would regenerate overnight, only to be eaten again the next day. This agony was meant to last forever, showing all of creation the price of defying the king of the gods for the sake of mortals. The creation of Pandora, the ultimate ironic punishment. Zeus wasn't done yet. Since Prometheus had gifted men fire, Zeus decided to give men a gift in return, a punishment disguised as a blessing. He ordered Hephaestus, the genius craftsman, to mold the first woman out of clay and water. She was then beautified by Aphrodite, given cunning persuasion by Hermes, and gifted all things by the other gods. She was named Pandora, meaning all gifts. Pandora was the ultimate ironic punishment, something beautiful, desirable, and ultimately catastrophic. Zeus then presented Pandora, along with a mysterious jar, often mistranslated as a box, to Epimetheus. Prometheus had warned his brother Epimetheus never to accept gifts from Zeus, but Epimetheus
true to his name, Afterthought, forgot the warning the moment he saw the stunning Pandora and immediately accepted both her and the jar. The opening of the jar. Pandora was consumed by curiosity about the mysterious jar Zeus had given her. One day, her curiosity overwhelmed her, and she lifted the lid. The moment the jar was opened, all the evils, woes, suffering, disease, pain, and labor that had never existed before immediately flew out and spread across the earth, plaguing mankind forever. Terrified, Pandora immediately slammed the lid shut. But one thing remained inside, tracked at the very bottom: hope. The Greek message here is complex and deeply pessimistic. The introduction of woman to the world was framed as the ultimate punishment, bringing all suffering into the realm of men. The only saving grace was that hope remained trapped inside, accessible, but only after all the other evils had escaped. So Zeus's revenge was complete. The champion of man, Prometheus, was chained and tortured forever, and mankind itself was cursed with disease and suffering, all because of a moment of divine anger and a trick over a pile of bones. Let's let the sounds of Prometheus's suffering and the quiet buzzing of the woes that escaped Pandora's jar gently fade as we move into the age where gods and mortals began to interbreed, creating a new line of tragic heroes. Part 5. Heracles, the Terrible Luck, and the 12 Labors. All right, everyone, settle in once more. We've reached the age where the lines between the divine and the mortal blur, leading to the birth of the greatest, strongest, and perhaps unluckiest hero of all time, Heracles, or Hercules, as the Romans called him. Heracles is the ultimate example of the chaotic aftermath of Zeus's affairs and Hera's unyielding vengeance. The problem of Heracles' conception. Heracles was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene. Zeus, using his standard trickery, disguised himself as Alcmene's husband Amphitryon, while Amphitryon was away at war. Zeus prolonged the night for 3 times its normal length to enjoy his illicit encounter, because why have one night when you can have 3? Hera, of course, was furious. She tried everything to prevent Heracles' birth, even sending the goddess of childbirth, Lithiace, to prolong Alcmene's labor. However, through a counter-deception, Heracles was finally born, strong, healthy, and marked for greatness. Hera's anger became the defining force of Heracles' life. She tried to kill him even as a baby, sending 2 massive snakes into his crib. The infant Heracles, demonstrating his superhuman strength for the first time, simply grabbed the snakes and strangled them, one in each tiny hand. The terrible divine curse. Despite his strength, Heracles had a complicated path to glory. Hera relentlessly pursued him, and her ultimate act of vengeance was psychological. When Heracles was a young man and had married and settled down with his first wife, Megara, Hera cast a profound and devastating spell of madness upon him. In his temporary, divinely induced insanity, Heracles tragically murdered his wife, Megara, and their children. When he finally awoke from the madness and realized the horror of what he had done, he was completely distraught. He was both the strongest man on earth and the most tragic. He sought purification and absolution for his terrible, unintentional crimes. The Oracle of Delphi, the famous prophetess of Apollo, instructed him that the only way to atone for his actions was to serve his cousin, King Eurystheus of Mycenae, for 12 years and perform any tasks Eurystheus set him. This was a profoundly humiliating task. Eurystheus was a weak, cowardly man, and Hera had ensured that Eurystheus was subservient to him. Eurystheus, being a coward, was absolutely terrified of Heracles and set him tasks designed to be impossible and deadly. The 12 labors, an exercise in divine servitude. The 12 labors are the defining feats of Heracles' life, showing his strength, endurance, and sometimes his sneaky cleverness. We will gently glide through the most significant ones. The Nemean lion. Heracles was ordered to bring back the skin of the Nemean lion, a massive beast with an impervious hide. Arrows, swords, and clubs were useless. Heracles finally cornered the lion and strangled it with his bare hands. Then he used the lion's own claws to skin it and wore the impenetrable hide as his armor forever after. The Lernaean Hydra. This monster was a swamp serpent with many heads. When one head was cut off, 2 new ones would immediately grow back, and one head was immortal. Heracles, realizing the futility of pure force, was helped by his nephew, Iolaus, who cauterized the neck stumps with fire after Heracles severed a head, preventing regrowth. Heracles finally buried the immortal head under a massive rock. The Augean Stables. This was a deliberate act of humiliation. Heracles was ordered to clean the stables of King Augeas, which housed thousands of cattle and hadn't been cleaned in 30 years. This wasn't a fight. It was cleaning up an unbelievable, grotesque mess. Heracles, refusing to shovel muck, simply diverted 2 entire rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, through the stables, washing away the filth in a single day. The Cretan Bull. Heracles was ordered to capture the beautiful, massive bull that had driven King Minos mad. He successfully captured it and brought it back to Mycenae, where Eurystheus, terrified, hid in a large storage jar. The Girdle of Hippolyta. Heracles was sent to retrieve the magical girdle of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. Hippolyta was actually quite charmed by Heracles and willingly offered him the belt. But Hera, ever the meddler, disguised herself, spread a rumor that Heracles was going to kidnap the queen, and incited the Amazons to attack, forcing Heracles to kill Hippolyta and take the belt by force. The Apples of the Hesperides. This was perhaps the most difficult task. Heracles had to retrieve the magical golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, which was guarded by a massive 100-headed dragon named Ladon. Heracles, using his intellect, and sometimes some friendly divine help, got the Titan Atlas to fetch the apples by temporarily holding the sky in Atlas's stead. When Atlas returned, he naturally decided he didn't want to take the heavens back. Heracles, using cunning, agreed, but asked Atlas to hold the sky for just 1 second while he adjusted his padding. Atlas took the sky, and Heracles immediately snatched the apples and walked away. A nice reminder that even heroes need a bit of quick thinking. The sad ending of the great hero. After completing the 12 labors and earning his purification, Heracles went on many other adventures. He was characterized by his explosive strength, his generosity to friends, and his frequent inability to control his massive temper, which often resulted in further violence and tragedy. His death, like his life, was accidental and tragic. He married a woman named Deianira. To secure her, he fought a centaur named Nessus. As the centaur lay dying, he tricked Deianira into taking some of his blood, telling her that it was a powerful love potion that would ensure Heracles would never leave her. Years later, when Deianira suspected Heracles was flirting with another woman, she smeared the centaur's blood, which was actually a powerful poison, onto a tunic and gave it to Heracles. The poison immediately burned Heracles' flesh with agonizing pain. Unable to die because of his divine heritage, he ordered his companions to build a funeral pyre and burn him alive to end his suffering. The moment the fire consumed his mortal half, Zeus snatched Heracles' immortal essence up to Olympus, where he was finally reconciled with Hera and married the goddess Hebe, youth. Heracles became the only man to achieve true godhood. His story is a continuous, exhausting cycle. Massive strength, immediate fame, divine jealousy, tragic mistake, enormous penance, repeat. Let's allow the sound of that centaur's tragic trickery and the crackle of Heracles' final pyre to fade as we move into the age of kings, heroes, and one very peculiar golden fleece. Of Jason and the Argonauts, and the truly chaotic life of the sorceress Medea. This is the story of a journey for a magical golden object, the golden fleece, and the terrible price of bringing magic home. Jason, the dispossessed prince. Our hero, Jason, was the rightful heir to the throne of Iolcus. However, his wicked uncle, Peleus, had usurped the throne. When Jason was a young man, he returned to Iolcus to claim his inheritance. Peleus, who knew he was dealing with destiny, had been warned by an oracle to beware the man with one sandal. Jason, having helped an old woman, who was secretly the goddess Hera in disguise, across a river and losing one sandal in the process, walked into the city with only one shoe. Peleus immediately recognized the prophecy. Peleus, being a classic manipulative uncle, agreed to hand over the throne, but only if Jason completed a seemingly impossible task, retrieving the legendary golden fleece from the distant, hostile land of Colchis. Peleus was sure Jason would die trying. The Argonauts, the original all-star team. Jason, of course, accepted the challenge. He commissioned the building of the greatest ship ever seen, the Argo, and assembled the crew of the Argonauts, an all-star team of Greek heroes and future legends. Heracles, yes, he was there, though he left early. Orpheus, the master musician, whose lyre playing could calm storms and silence sirens. The Dioscuri twins, Castor and Pollux, and many other famous names. Their journey was long and filled with the classic mythological obstacles, navigating the clashing rocks, Symplochides, that smash ships together, dealing with the seductive songs of the sirens, silenced by Orpheus's masterful music, and fighting various monstrous creatures. But the real drama began when they reached their destination, Colchis, a dark, mysterious kingdom ruled by King Aeetes, the guardian of the Golden Fleece. Medea, the problematic helper. The Golden Fleece was located in a sacred grove, guarded by a dragon that never slept. It was physically impossible to steal. However, Hera, who never forgot Jason's chivalry in helping her across the river, and who absolutely loved punishing the children of her husband's mistresses, decided to help Jason. She asked Aphrodite to make King Aeetes' daughter, the powerful sorceress Medea, fall violently in love with Jason. Medea was the ultimate mythological double-edged sword, deeply in love and possessing terrifying magical power. King Aeetes, like Peleus, offered Jason the fleece only if he completed 3 impossible tasks. Yoke fire-breathing oxen. He had to plow a field using 2 gigantic fire-breathing bulls. Sow dragon teeth. He then had to sow the plowed field with dragon teeth, which would instantly sprout into an army of fierce armored men. Finally, he had to defeat the spontaneous army. Medea, madly in love, provided Jason with a magic ointment that protected him from the bull's fire and gave him superhuman strength. She also instructed him on how to defeat the spontaneously grown army, throw a stone into their midst, causing the warriors to become confused and fight each other. Jason succeeded, But King Aeetes refused to hand over the fleece. Medea, loyal only to Jason and her passion, helped him steal the fleece by using a magical sleeping potion on the unsleeping dragon. Medea and Jason fled Colchis, but King Aeetes' fleet pursued them relentlessly. In order to ensure their escape, Medea committed her first truly unforgivable crime. She killed her own brother, Absyrtus, who was pursuing them. She chopped up his body and tossed the pieces into the sea, knowing that her father, Aeetes, would be honor-bound to stop and collect every single piece for a proper funeral. This act of familial betrayal and desecration bought the Argonauts the necessary time to escape. They finally made it back to Iolcus with the fleece. King Peleus, predictably, still refused to give up the throne. Medea, without consulting Jason, decided to resolve this problem herself. She convinced Peleus's daughters that she could restore her aging father's youth. She demonstrated by taking an old ram, chopping it up, boiling it in a special cauldron with herbs, and pulling out a young lamb. She convinced the daughters that this potion would work for their father, but deliberately withheld the one necessary revitalizing herb. The daughters, believing her, killed their own father, Peleus, and boiled him in the cauldron. He did not emerge young again. Jason and Medea had successfully claimed the throne, but Medea's chilling acts of murder and deception, killing her brother and tricking the daughters into patricide, terrified the people of Iolcus. Jason and Medea were immediately exiled. The tragedy in Corinth. Jason and Medea fled to Corinth, where they lived for many years and had 2 sons. Jason, however, tired of his exotic sorceress wife and longed for a politically convenient Greek marriage. He decided to abandon Medea and marry Glauca, the princess of Corinth. Medea was, quite understandably, shattered. Her love for Jason had caused her to commit every imaginable crime: matricide, patricide by proxy, and betrayal of her home. Now she was to be cast aside. Medea's revenge is the climax of her tragedy. She poisoned a beautiful gown and diadem and sent them as a wedding gift to Glauca. When she put them on, the poison clung to her flesh, killing her and her father, the king of Corinth. But Medea was not done. To completely obliterate Jason's future and sever all ties to her husband, Medea murdered her own 2 sons. Then she escaped to Athens in a dragon-drawn chariot, leaving Jason alone, ruined, and heartbroken. The story of Jason is not about the brave quest. It's about the catastrophic consequences of taking Medea, the ultimate chaotic force, as a wife, all orchestrated by Hera's initial favor. Let's allow the unsettling, dark tragedy of Medea's vengeance and the crackling sound of the poisoned gown to fade. Next, we turn our attention to the war that defined the final age of Greek mythology.
All right, everyone. We're moving into the final magnificent phase of the mythological age, the event that dominates all of Greek literature and memory, the Trojan War. But this enormous decade-long conflict didn't begin with grand armies. It began, as all great mythological disasters do, with an uninvited wedding guest and a golden apple. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis, the omission. Our story starts with a wedding that was supposed to be a joyous, uniting occasion. The Olympian gods had decided to marry the beautiful sea nymph Thetis off to a mortal man named Peleus. Thetis was actually quite important. Zeus himself had once pursued her, but a terrifying prophecy stated that Thetis would bear a son who would be greater than his father.
Since Zeus had already overthrown his own father, Cronus, and Cronus had overthrown his father, Uranus, Zeus decided he was not risking that fate. He married Thetis off to a mortal to ensure that her son, while great, would still be bound by mortality. So the wedding feast was held. Every single god, goddess, nymph, and creature was invited to celebrate the union of Thetis and Peleus. It was meant to be the party of the millennium, except for one. The one deity who was deliberately and pointedly not invited was Eris, the goddess of discord and strife. Because, naturally, if you're trying to have a nice, peaceful wedding, you don't invite the literal personification of petty arguments and chaos. The golden apple and the catfight. Eris was, of course, utterly furious at this snub. She decided that she wasn't going to show up and ruin the party herself. She would send a proxy. She waited until the feast was in full swing, and then, in one of the most brilliant and devastating acts of spite in all of mythology, Eris rolled a single golden apple into the banquet hall. The apple was inscribed with one simple, loaded phrase: "To the fairest." Immediately, the feast dissolved into utter chaos. 3 Olympian goddesses immediately claimed the apple: Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of jealousy; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war strategy; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. The argument that ensued was spectacular, relentless, and completely undermined the entire wedding. The 3 most powerful goddesses in the cosmos were locked in a bitter, screaming catfight, all desperate for the title of fairest. Finally, the shouting became so unbearable that they appealed to Zeus to judge them. Zeus, who wanted absolutely nothing to do with this problem and was terrified of alienating any of the 3, politely and wisely declined. He essentially said, "Nope, I'm not touching that one." Instead, Zeus pawned the terrible decision off to a mortal: Paris, the ignored prince. Zeus instructed the goddesses to seek out a mortal shepherd named Paris on Mount Ida to act as their judge. Paris was in fact not a shepherd at all, but a prince of Troy. His mother, Hecuba, had experienced a terrifying dream before his birth that he would cause the destruction of the city. The royal family, taking the prophecy seriously for once, had abandoned baby Paris on Mount Ida, where he was raised by shepherds. Paris was handsome, youthful, and completely unprepared for the terrifying responsibility about to be thrust upon him. The 3 goddesses appeared before the lonely shepherd and demanded he choose the fairest. This was truly impossible decision, so they immediately resorted to bribery. Hera promised Paris political power and wealth. She would make him the ruler of all Asia. Athena promised Paris military glory and wisdom. She would make him an invincible warrior and the wisest man alive. And Aphrodite promised Paris something much simpler, much dumber, and infinitely more consequential: the love of the most beautiful woman in the entire world. Paris, being a young hormone-driven prince who was tired of looking after sheep, immediately chose Aphrodite. He wasn't interested in conquering Asia or achieving wisdom, he just wanted the girl. The prize: the abduction of Helen. Aphrodite, having secured the title of fairest, now had to deliver on her promise. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen of Sparta. There was just one highly inconvenient problem: Helen was already married. She was the wife of Menelaus, the powerful king of Sparta, and brother to Agamemnon, the even more powerful king of Mycenae. Furthermore, before she married Menelaus, All her suitors had been forced to swear a sacred oath to defend Helen and Menelaus against anyone who tried to steal her. This oath would prove to be Troy's undoing. Paris, guided by Aphrodite, traveled to Sparta and was treated as an honored guest by Menelaus. While Menelaus was away on a diplomatic mission, because why leave your supernaturally beautiful wife alone with a handsome, prophecy-doomed prince, Paris either seduced or forcibly abducted Helen and sailed back to Troy. The motivation for Helen's departure remains slightly ambiguous. Did she go willingly, blinded by Aphrodite's magic, or was she simply taken? Mythology offers different versions, but the result was the same. The wife of the king of Sparta was gone. The call to war. Menelaus was absolutely incandescent with rage, humiliation, and betrayal. He immediately called upon his older brother, Agamemnon, the most powerful king of Greece. Agamemnon, seeing an opportunity for wealth and glory, didn't hesitate. He sent messengers across all the Greek kingdoms, reminding them of the oath they had sworn to protect Helen and Menelaus. The oath held. All the greatest kings and heroes of Greece, including the mighty Achilles, the cunning Odysseus, and the strong Ajax, were bound by a sacred vow to retrieve Helen and punish Troy. Thus, the greatest war of the ancient world was launched not over territory or gold, but over the catastrophic consequences of a single petty argument at a wedding and the foolish choice of a shepherd prince. Let's allow the sound of those Greek ships gathering in the harbors and the indignant shouts of the betrayed King Menelaus gently fade. Next, we'll see how the assembled Greeks finally got to Troy and the initial conflicts of the war.
All right, everyone. We're drifting now to the culmination of the Greek heroes assembling for the Trojan War. The rage of Menelaus was enough, but it was the oath of the suitors that truly bound the great Greek kingdoms to the cause. The heroes were gathered under the overall command of Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae and brother of Menelaus. Agamemnon was powerful, wealthy, and profoundly arrogant. Not a charismatic leader, but the one with the biggest army. The problematic heroes. Getting the greatest heroes to actually go to war was often more difficult than the fighting itself. The Greeks wasted valuable time just trying to convince their best men to show up. Odysseus, the pretending madman. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, was famously cunning and had no desire to leave his newlywed wife Penelope and their infant son Telemachus. When the Greek messengers arrived, Odysseus feigned madness. He plowed his fields with a donkey and an ox harnessed together, two mismatched animals showing insanity, and sowed the field with salt instead of seed. The messenger, Palamedes, proved that Odysseus was faking. He gently placed the infant Telemachus in the path of the plow. Odysseus immediately stopped the plow to avoid harming his son, thereby revealing his sanity. He was forced to join the war, but he never forgave Palamedes for the trick. Achilles, the cross-dressing warrior. Achilles was the son of Thetis and Peleus, the wedding we discussed earlier. He was the greatest warrior the Greeks possessed, but his mother, Thetis, knew the prophecy. If Achilles went to Troy, he would achieve eternal glory, but die young. If he stayed home, he would live a long, obscure life. Thetis hid her son on the island of Skyros, disguised as a woman among the daughters of the local king, Lycomedes. Odysseus and Diomedes were sent to find him. They arrived at the court disguised as merchants and laid out various wares, silks, jewelry, and secretly a sword and shield.
While the princesses examined the jewelry, the wily Odysseus had a trumpet sounded. Achilles, by pure instinct, immediately grabbed the weapons and adopted a defensive military stance, revealing his identity. He was caught and had to join the army. The sacrifice at Aulis. Finally, the massive fleet and army assembled at the port of Aulis, but they hit an immediate, agonizing roadblock. The wind stopped. For days, then weeks, the Greek fleet was trapped in the harbor, becalmed by a mysterious, relentless stillness. The supplies began to run low, the men grew restless, and the entire expedition threatened to dissolve before it even started. Agamemnon summoned the great prophet Calchas to find the divine reason for this cruel delay. Calchas delivered a terrifying message. The goddess Artemis was angry. Agamemnon, in a moment of arrogance, had once boasted that he was a better hunter than Artemis herself, a truly stupid boast, considering she's the goddess of the hunt. The only way to appease the angry goddess and raise the winds was to make a supreme sacrifice. Agamemnon had to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon was initially horrified, but under immense pressure from the army, which wanted to sail, and his brother Menelaus, who wanted his wife back, Agamemnon made a cold, political calculation. He agreed to the sacrifice. He sent a message to his wife, Clytemnestra, back in Mycenae, telling her to bring Iphigenia to Aulis, under the false pretense that the girl was to marry the great hero Achilles. Iphigenia arrived, excited for her supposed wedding. Achilles, who was completely unaware of the plot, was furious and tried to intervene, but the momentum of the army was too great. Agamemnon proceeded with the sacrifice. At the moment of the sacrifice, there are different versions of the myth. In some, Artemis relents and substitutes a deer for Iphigenia, whisking the girl away to safety. But the most common and most tragic version is that Iphigenia was killed. The gods were satisfied. Immediately, the winds rose, and the massive fleet of over 1,000 ships finally sailed across the Aegean Sea toward the walled city of Troy. The first decade of failure. The Greek army finally landed on the beaches of Troy, only to find the city was not a pushover. Troy, or Ilium, was protected by massive, legendary walls and defended by a fierce and noble army under King Priam and his sons, most notably the great hero Hector. The war immediately settled into a grinding siege. For 9 long years, the Greeks achieved almost nothing. They failed to breach the walls of Troy and spent their time instead raiding the smaller surrounding cities for supplies, loot, and captive women. This 9-year period was characterized by boredom and restlessness, petty arguments. The leaders spent more time bickering over shares of the spoils, captive women, and personal insults than fighting the enemy. And the power of Hector. The Trojan hero Hector, the greatest defender of his city, proved to be an overwhelming military force, often driving the Greeks back to their ships. The main consequence of this long, quiet, unexciting siege was the buildup of tension and resentment among the Greek leaders, particularly between the two most important men, the commander, Agamemnon, and the greatest warrior, Achilles. The war was about to enter its 10th and final explosive year, a year defined entirely by the petty squabble that broke out between the Greeks' two most powerful figures. Let's allow the feeling of those 9 years of wasted boredom and the lingering resentment of that terrible sacrifice at Aulis gently guide us. Next, we will cover the core of the epic conflict, the feud between Achilles and Agamemnon. All right, everyone, we're sinking into the final, defining year of the Trojan War, the year that forms the basis of Homer's great epic, the Iliad. After 9 years of boredom and bickering, the Greek campaign was finally crippled by the most juvenile, self-destructive argument in history: the problem of the captive women. The conflict began, as many things do in this story, over a trivial piece of loot, a captive woman. During a raid, the Greeks had captured 2 beautiful women, Chryseis and Briseis. Chryseis was awarded to the commander, Agamemnon. Briseis was awarded to the greatest warrior, Achilles. Chryseis' father was a priest of Apollo. He came to the Greek camp offering a massive ransom for his daughter's return. Agamemnon, being arrogant and greedy, refused and insulted the priest, chasing him away. The priest prayed to his god, and Apollo, being incredibly protective of his worshippers and loving a bit of chaos, responded by unleashing a deadly plague upon the Greek army. The Greeks began dying in massive numbers, quietly and terribly, in their camp. The prophet Calchas, the same one from the Aeolus sacrifice, finally revealed the cause. Apollo was angry, and Chryseis had to be returned. The Great Greek Meltdown. Agamemnon was furious at being publicly called out by the prophet. He was forced to return Chryseis, but because he was unwilling to lose face, or his prize, he did the most petty, spiteful thing imaginable. He decided to take Achilles captive, Briseis, as compensation. Achilles, who was not just romantically involved with Briseis, but viewed the award as a symbol of his honor and worth, was incandescent with rage. This wasn't about the woman. It was about the fundamental disrespect shown by his commander. The argument that followed was spectacular. Achilles threatened to leave the war immediately. Agamemnon reminded Achilles that he was in command. Agamemnon ultimately sent his men and forcibly took Briseis. This act of profound public humiliation caused Achilles to withdraw from the entire war. He gathered his loyal Myrmidons, vowed he would not fight again until the Greeks were burning in their ships, and sulked in his tent. The tide turns. Zeus intervenes. Achilles, being the son of the sea nymph Thetis, complained bitterly to his mother. Thetis, heartbroken by her son's humiliation, went directly to Zeus on Mount Olympus and pleaded for him to punish the Greeks for dishonoring Achilles. Zeus, who was generally inclined to favor the Trojans because he liked King Priam, agreed to intervene. He sent a deceptive dream to Agamemnon, promising him an immediate victory. The result of Zeus's intervention and Achilles' withdrawal was immediate and catastrophic for the Greeks. Without their greatest warrior, the tide of the war turned violently in favor of the Trojans. Hector, the greatest Trojan hero, led relentless assaults that pushed the Greeks back, breaching their wall and setting fire to their ships. The Greeks, led by Agamemnon, who was now panicking, offered every imaginable treasure, including the return of Briseis untouched, to Achilles if he would just rejoin the fight. Achilles coldly refused it all. He was still too consumed by the wound to his honor. Patroclus's fatal decision. The one person who could reach Achilles was his closest companion, Patroclus. Patroclus watched with despair as the Greeks were slaughtered, the smoke rising from their burning ships, a terrible sign of the impending disaster. Patroclus begged Achilles to return. When Achilles still refused, Patroclus made a desperate plea. If Achilles would not fight, could Patroclus at least wear Achilles' famous god-forged armor? Achilles, still nursing his immense grudge, agreed to this compromise. He allowed Patroclus to wear the armor, leading the Myrmidons back into battle. His instructions were strict: only drive the Trojans back from the ships and do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. The sight of the famous armor immediately struck fear into the Trojans, who thought Achilles himself had returned. Patroclus, filled with the excitement of battle and the power of the armor, ignored Achilles' orders. He pursued the Trojans, fighting furiously until he reached the very walls of Troy. There, Patroclus met his terrible end. He was first stunned by Apollo, the god who started this mess with the plague, wounded by a minor Trojan warrior, and finally killed by the mighty hand of Hector. Hector stripped the magnificent armor from Patroclus' body, wearing it as his own trophy. The Greeks barely managed to retrieve Patroclus' naked corpse. Achilles' return, the fury unbound. The news of Patroclus' death shattered Achilles. His rage over the loss of his honor immediately dissolved into a blinding, profound grief and a singular desire for vengeance. He cried out in such terrible agony that his goddess mother Thetis heard him from the depths of the sea. Thetis arrived to comfort her son and informed him that he could not rejoin the fight without armor. She flew to the forge of Hephaestus, the lame exiled smith god, and begged him to forge a new, spectacular suit of armor for her son. Hephaestus delivered. The new armor, especially the famous shield of Achilles, which depicted the entire cosmos and life of man in intricate detail, was a masterpiece. Achilles, clad in his new armor and consumed by the fury of his loss, formally reconciled with Agamemnon, who quickly gave back Briseis and all the treasure, which Achilles now barely cared about, and re-entered the battlefield, utterly transformed from a sulking prince into an unstoppable force of divine vengeance. The final, terrifying act of the Iliad had begun. Achilles was no longer fighting for Greek honor, for Helen, or for treasure. He was fighting only to find and kill Hector. Let's let the sound of Achilles' terrible war cry and the ringing of Hephaestus' hammer gently guide us to the final, fatal duel beneath the walls of Troy.
All right, everyone, settle in. We are witnessing the final, brutal confrontation beneath the massive walls of Troy. A moment that is less about war strategy and more about the terrible, personal cost of revenge. Achilles is back, and he is a god-fueled engine of grief and fury. The duel and the desperation of Troy. Achilles immediately tore through the Trojan lines, slaughtering hundreds of men in his pursuit. The river Scamander ran red with blood, and the river god himself was so affronted by the carnage that he attacked Achilles, who only escaped with the help of Hephaestus' divine fire. Finally, Achilles cornered the man he sought, Hector, the noble protector of Troy. King Priam and Queen Hecuba pleaded from the walls for their son to come inside, but Hector, knowing that he was the only thing standing between Achilles and the total destruction of his city and family, stood his ground outside the Scaean gate. The duel was terrifyingly brief. Hector, though brave and powerful, was no match for the enraged, divinely protected Achilles. When Achilles finally plunged his spear into Hector's throat, the one place not protected by the armor Patroclus had been wearing, the noble defender of Troy fell. The desecration, the fury, goes too far. The murder of Hector should have been enough, but Achilles' grief was so profound that his fury crossed the line from justified vengeance into monstrous cruelty. Achilles stripped Hector's body of the armor that once belonged to Patroclus, and then committed the most egregious act of disrespect possible in ancient Greece. He pierced Hector's ankles, threaded a leather thong through them, and lashed the body to the back of his chariot.
Achilles then drove his chariot in furious laps around the walls of Troy, dragging Hector's body through the dust and stones as King Priam and the entire city watched from the ramparts in utter, howling despair. For 12 consecutive days, Achilles repeated this agonizing, blasphemous act, refusing to allow the body to be buried. This was not the behavior of a hero. It was the meltdown of a deeply traumatized man. The gods themselves were disgusted. Apollo intervened to miraculously preserve Hector's corpse, preventing it from being further mangled, but the shame remained. The old king's plea. Finally, Zeus sent a message to Achilles via the messenger god Hermes, demanding that Achilles return the body. That same night, the aged King Priam, guided and protected by Hermes, slipped out of the city and traveled alone through the dark to the Greek camp, walking directly into the enemy's barracks and into Achilles' tent. Priam knelt and kissed the terrible, murderous hands of the man who had just killed his favorite son, pleading for the return of Hector's body. He asked Achilles to think of his own aging father, Peleus, who would soon suffer the same loss. This moment of profound, shared human grief finally broke Achilles' rage. He wept, thinking of his own inevitable death and his father's future loss. He and Priam shared a moment of silent, mutual respect across the lines of war and enmity. Achilles gently returned the carefully washed body of Hector and granted a 12-day truce so the Trojans could mourn and perform the proper funeral rites. The Iliad ends not with a great victory, but with the quiet, respectful funeral of the man who died protecting his home. The death of the great warrior. The war resumed after the funeral, but Achilles' time was short. He achieved more brief, spectacular victories, including killing the great Amazon queen Penthesilea and the Ethiopian prince Memnon, before his own prophecy finally came due. Achilles was ultimately killed by Paris, the useless shepherd prince who started the war by being a fool for love. Paris, who was a terrible fighter but a decent archer, was guided by the vengeful god Apollo. Apollo directed Paris's arrow to the single, legendary vulnerable spot on Achilles' body, his heel. Why the heel? When Achilles was an infant, his mother, Thetis, dipped him into the waters of the river Styx, the river of the underworld, to make him invulnerable. However, she held him by his heel, and that spot where her hand covered him remained mortal and unprotected. The arrow pierced his heel, and the greatest hero of the Greek world, the invincible son of a goddess, died a simple, avoidable death from a single, lucky shot. The heroic age ends. The death of Achilles was a crippling blow to the Greek morale, but it was also a sign that the age of the great divine heroes was over. With Achilles gone, the Greeks knew they could not defeat the Trojans in open battle. They had to rely on something far more tricky, subtle, and profoundly Greek: deception. The stage was now set for the final legendary act of the Trojan War, orchestrated by the war's true intellectual, the cunning king of Ithaca, Odysseus. Let's allow the tragic sound of Achilles' final cry and the quiet dignity of King Priam's journey to the Greek camp to fade. Next, we will cover the final decisive moments of the war, the creation of the infamous wooden horse, and the subsequent fall of Troy.
All right, everyone, settle in. We are approaching the climax of the Trojan War, a moment defined not by force, but by the cunning brilliance of one man, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the one who tried to plow his field with salt to avoid this whole disaster. After the death of Achilles, the Greeks were desperate. They had lost their greatest hero. They had suffered a brutal siege for 10 years, and they knew they could never take the massive walls of Troy in a straight fight. The invention of the horse. Odysseus realized that the only way to win was through a masterpiece of deception. He conceived of the plan for the wooden horse. Hephaestus' son, Epeius, an excellent craftsman, was tasked with building a gigantic, hollow wooden horse. The largest, strongest, and cunning Greek warriors, including Odysseus himself, would hide inside the horse. The rest of the Greek army would then burn their camp and pretend to sail away, retreating from the war forever. The horse would be left outside the walls as a supposed offering to the goddess Athena, meant to ensure the Greeks a safe voyage home. It was a brilliant plan, relying entirely on Trojan pride, curiosity, and religious piety. Sinon, the art of the perfect lie. The Greeks needed someone to sell the lie. That person was a Greek soldier named Sinon. When the Greeks sailed away, leaving the massive horse behind, Sinon was left behind, tied up near the Trojan walls. The Trojans, cautiously emerging from their city after a decade of siege, found Sinon and dragged him before King Priam. Sinon, a master actor, wept and claimed that he had been unjustly persecuted by Odysseus and that the Greeks had planned to sacrifice him to the gods for favorable winds. He swore that he was now loyal only to the Trojans. He then explained the horse. It was a religious offering to Athena, built so large that the Trojans could not fit it inside their walls. He claimed that if the Trojans managed to bring the horse into the city, they would secure Athena's divine favor, making Troy invincible and allowing them to eventually conquer Greece. He emphasized that the Greeks made it large specifically to prevent this. The temptation was too great. The thought of securing divine protection and turning the tables on their defeated enemies convinced King Priam. Laocoon's warning and the divine silence. Not everyone was fooled, however. The priest of Apollo, Laocoon, standing outside the walls, saw through the entire ruse. He famously warned the Trojans with the great line, "I fear the Greeks, even when they bear gifts." He even drove his spear into the side of the wooden horse, and the hidden Greek warriors inside reportedly trembled. This was the moment of truth. The gods, who were firmly on the side of the Greek victory at this point, could not tolerate this interference. As Laocoon was trying to convince the Trojans to burn the horse, two massive sea serpents suddenly emerged from the waves. They wrapped themselves around Laocoon and his two sons, crushing them to death right there in front of the horrified Trojan crowd. The Trojans interpreted this terrifying event as a clear sign. Laocoon was punished for disrespecting the divine gift meant for Athena. The gods wanted them to bring the horse inside. The people rejoiced. They tore down a section of their massive legendary walls and, in a final ironic act, spent the day pulling the huge wooden horse into the heart of their city. They celebrated their supposed victory with food, wine, and music. The night of utter destruction. That night, Troy was filled with celebratory exhaustion. The people finally felt safe after a decade of terror, and they slept deeply. Just after midnight, the real action began. The signal. Sinon, waiting for the darkest hour, released the trapdoor on the horse and gave a signal to the waiting Greek fleet, which had only sailed as far as a nearby island. The infiltration. The Greek heroes climbed out of the horse, and Odysseus and Menelaus immediately moved to the city gates, killing the guards. The slaughter. The slaughter that followed was horrific, fast, and unforgiving. The Trojans, unarmed and asleep, were butchered in the streets and homes. The city was systematically looted and set on fire. The Trojan royal family was destroyed. King Priam was brutally killed at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, despite being an old man seeking sanctuary. Queen Hecuba was taken captive.
Polyxena, Priam's daughter, was later sacrificed on Achilles' tomb, a final dark request from the dead hero. Astyanax, the young son of Hector, was thrown from the city walls to prevent him from ever growing up to seek vengeance. Troy was completely obliterated, its royal line annihilated, and its people enslaved. The Greeks had finally won. The gods' displeasure. However, the gods were not pleased with the manner of victory. The Greeks, triumphant and drunk with victory, committed massive acts of sacrilege. They dragged women from the altars of the gods and slaughtered men who had sought sanctuary. Ajax the Lesser, in particular, dragged the Trojan princess Cassandra, who was now a priestess of Athena, from the temple of Athena and raped her. Athena, whose horse had just helped win the war, was so enraged by this sacrilege that she, along with Poseidon, vowed to punish the Greeks and ensure their journey home was a devastating nightmare. The tragic cycle of the Trojan War was complete, but the subsequent sufferings of the Greek heroes, known as the Nostoi, the returns, was just about to begin. Let us allow the sound of the burning city and the triumphant and vengeful cries of the Greeks to fade as we shift to the scattered, chaotic journey home.
All right, everyone, we've reached the final section of our massive, sleepy dive into Greek mythology. Troy has fallen, the decade-long war is over, and the Greeks have won. But as we know, the gods absolutely hate sacrilege. And the Greeks' horrific behavior during the sacking of Troy, especially the actions of Ajax the Lesser, ensured that their journey home, the Nostoi, the returns, would be a decade-long nightmare of vengeance. The wrath of the gods. Athena and Poseidon, despite having helped the Greeks win the war, teamed up to ensure the fleet never made it home easily. Athena, enraged by the sacrilege in her temple, convinced Poseidon to unleash catastrophic storms upon the returning ships. The fleet was scattered, sunk, and scattered again. Many heroes, including Ajax the Lesser, died ignominiously at sea, their ships dashed against rocks by the vengeful gods. The few who survived the initial onslaught had to face the quiet, simmering personal grudges that had been brewing back home during their 10 years away. Agamemnon's tragic welcome. Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae and supreme commander of the Greek forces, had the fastest and least complicated journey home, largely avoiding the worst of the storms. This was ironic, as he was sailing toward the worst personal fate. Back in Mycenae, his wife, Clytemnestra, had not forgotten the awful sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia, at Aulis 10 years prior. That injustice had festered into a consuming, volcanic rage. During Agamemnon's absence, Clytemnestra had taken a lover, Aegisthus, Agamemnon's cousin, who also held a family grudge. They had been planning their revenge for years. When Agamemnon finally arrived home, triumphant and exhausted, he was greeted by his wife with feigned love and joy. Clytemnestra invited him into the palace and encouraged him to relax in his bath. While he was bathing, naked and defenseless, Clytemnestra, and sometimes Aegisthus, ambushed and murdered him. Agamemnon's victory at Troy led only to a swift, bloody, and entirely deserved revenge at home. His story served as a dark, cautionary tale. You might conquer an empire, but you cannot escape the fury of a wronged wife. His murder sets up the next generation's tragic cycle of vengeance, which later involves his son, Orestes. Menelaus and the awkward reunion. Menelaus, the king of Sparta, whose wife Helen started the whole war, had a much longer journey home. His fleet was scattered, and he wandered the seas for 8 years, visiting Egypt and North Africa, searching for a way to secure safe passage. He finally made it back to Sparta with Helen. The reunion, naturally, was incredibly awkward. Was Helen innocent,
Was she a willing adulteress? Did she deserve to be punished? Menelaus, realizing that a decade of his life had been wasted on this woman, ultimately decided to forgive her. He was happy to simply be home and resumed his life as king of Sparta with the most beautiful and most infamous woman in the world. Their story ends not with a tragic climax, but with a weary sigh of forgiveness and acceptance. Odysseus' 10-year detour. And finally, we come to one man whose return defined the whole post-war era, Odysseus. Odysseus was the one who conceived the Trojan horse, but he was also the one who constantly slighted the gods. He especially drew the ire of Poseidon, the god of the sea. This meant that his journey home would take another 10 grueling years. Odysseus' saga is the final great mythological journey, a series of episodic disasters. The Cyclops, Polyphemus. Odysseus blinded the giant Cyclops, a son of Poseidon, incurring the sea god's personal eternal wrath. Poseidon vowed to ensure Odysseus never saw Ithaca again. Circe and the Lotus Eaters. He faced the seductive magic of Circe, who turned his men into pigs, and the temptation of the Lotus Eaters, whose flowers made men forget their homes. The underworld. He descended into the underworld to seek counsel from the prophet Tiresias. Scylla and Charybdis. He navigated the monstrous whirlpool and the six-headed sea monster. But the final agonizing block on his path was the nymph Calypso. Poseidon's storms sank his last ship, and Odysseus washed ashore on Calypso's remote island. Calypso was a beautiful nymph who fell instantly and deeply in love with the hero. She offered him the ultimate prize, immortality and eternal happiness with her. Odysseus, however, refused. He was defined by his nostalgia, his aching desire to return to his mortal wife Penelope and his rocky island of Ithaca. For 7 long years, Calypso held him captive, weeping by the shore, constantly pining for home despite the offer of godhood. This commitment to his mortal life is what defines him as a hero. Eventually, the gods on Olympus, specifically Athena, convinced Zeus to intervene. Zeus ordered Calypso to release Odysseus. Calypso, heartbroken, helped him build a raft, and Odysseus finally sailed off toward his ultimate, final destination. He would finally reach Ithaca, but only after one last shipwreck, a beggar's disguise, and the necessary slaughter of the insolent suitors who had been attempting to woo Penelope in his long absence. The age of myth had concluded. The Titans were locked away. The Olympians ruled supreme, contempt in their feuds and affairs. The great heroes were either dead, murdered, or finally returned home, leaving behind a world ready for the rise of history.